Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you guys for joining us. Welcome to our webinar on MSO marketing. I was checking out the registration list this morning and I see a lot of current clients, individuals that I've crossed paths with, some of our PE firm and referral partners, and a lot of you that we've never met before. So we've got an awesome group here and we're super excited to dive in and do what we love to do, myself, Rich, and Jacqueline, which is share our knowledge, what we see across organizations that we're working with, that we are meeting with, the best practices and what we found worked and hasn't worked. Ultimately, what we're going to tell you and what you're going to learn today is there's no perfect answer. Sometimes we get asked, what is the answer? And there are multiple answers to how to build a digital foundation for an MSO based on where you are in your maturity and growth scale, what your kind of contractual obligations are to your acquisitions, how de novos play in. So we want to talk through those nuances with you and give you some tips and tricks that hopefully you can take back to your team and start deploying right away. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're going to do a bit of a hybrid discussion and presentation. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, which are my lovely coworkers, and then we'll dive into some discussion. So bear with me while I pop this up for us. Just a reminder on our topic. Hopefully you guys are at the right event. We'll have some additional ones coming later this year on things like recruitment marketing, but today we're here to talk about how to build and scale your digital foundation. Scale and growth being key. We know that those are pain points and we want to put infrastructure in place that allows us to grow. So I'm going to go ahead and click us into the next slide here. So I want to introduce first Rich. Rich and I have been working together for 9 years, Rich. I think you're coming up on 9 years and I was here just a little bit before you. So yeah, we've been doing this for a long time. Rich runs our strategy and analytics teams. Really, Rich built our capabilities in media. He built our capabilities in data analytics, data transformation, data visualization. So not only is he here to talk about, what he sees with the clients, but he's definitely an innovator in that space. So we're happy to have him on. You'll see some names here. Being the leader of our media and strategy team, Rich has worked on accounts like LifeStance Health. He's worked in the vet space. He's worked in the dental space. So his experience kind of spans all of the different verticals in healthcare. I've worked specifically with Rich and Jacqueline to build an MSO from the ground up, and we've come in when an MSO is in its later stages of funding. So he's probably seen it all. And Rich, happy to have you on again. I think you've been one of my guests before.
I have, and it's always a pleasure to be here.
And many of you have probably also at some point, whether it be on our podcast or on one of these events before, come across our director of SEO, Jacqueline Green. Jacqueline, I think, director as a title probably doesn't do it justice. Jacqueline runs the entire SEO team here at Cardinal. She is the strategist. She does a lot of innovating on how we implement, how we do things smarter, how we think about AI. You'll see some clients here as well that overlap with Rich and some that, we've been the builder of their SEO from the ground up. Behavioral health, hospital systems, home care. She's seen it all as well. So Jacqueline, happy to have you on. And I know the MSO discussion often starts with how do I structure my digital entities? So we're going to want to pick your brain on that.
For sure. Excited to be here.
So quickly before, I'm going to take the screen share off in a minute so that we can just have a discussion. But before I do that, just a quick expectation setter for you, something that's important in how we communicate with our patients and is important to us too, and how we communicate with you all. We're going to, we just did our intros. I'm going to take the screen share down and have just a conversation with Rich and Jacqueline on what they see as the typical challenges with MSOs. I think that just will help frame up that if you're experiencing these challenges, you're not alone, that we see them, we're constantly thinking of ways to tackle those challenges. And then we'll go ahead and pop back up this screen share, which you're going to get access to this recording and to this deck as well, so that you can look at this in more detail. But we want to look at how goals should help shape that strategy and be the foundation, picking Jacqueline's brain on what are scalable website solutions and how does the SEO foundation become part of building your website. Then we'll get back over with Rich and talk about the analytics and the marketing tech stack that ideally you would put in place alongside the other foundational items, so that you kind of have all those pieces together and ready to go at once. And then from there, we get into how do we really start acquiring patients? How do we think about, provider capacity? And a lot of that is going to come through the paid media strategies. So that's just a little bit about what to expect today. I'm going to turn off the screen share, and I've noticed a few of you have started doing this, but please feel free in the chat to ask questions, whether it's during our discussion or during our presentation. We would love to hear from you. You all can put those in the chat. I will monitor those and we'll ask them of the team as we go. There were some questions submitted in the registration forms as well, so we appreciate you all putting those out in front of us. We used them in building this content to make sure we were hitting on the points that you wanted to talk about. And I'm going to bring a couple of them up either during the presentation or in the Q&A so that we make sure they get answered. And if anything doesn't get answered today, I'll follow up with you individually one-on-one to make sure that we do get those questions answered for you. So let's go ahead and just dive into our discussion. And I think the best place to start is, Rich, I'll start with you, and then Jacqueline, I want to get your opinion here. But, the number one question I think we get asked, and it's based on a challenge, is should I retain a house of brands or should I start rolling them up? And I think this is fundamentally, what I said, there is no perfect answer, but Rich, I would love to hear your thoughts on how you approach that question and how you think about it. And then Jacqueline will do the same.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors that roll into that decision. One of which is more in sort of your operational control, which is how much budget do I have to support my marketing efforts and build brand equity, right? And typically, if you have more budget, then a multi-brand strategy is more attainable, right? Because you can brand multiple brands to multiple different customer segments. You can support those brands. The other factor is, who is your consumer, and are they seeking the same thing or are they seeking different things, right? So we work with a group that they are a multi-brand group here at Cardinal, and they do, each brand within the portfolio does slightly different things. And so the benefit for them, continuing to be multi-brand, even though they're an MSO, is that each brand can essentially be recognized as a leader in that specific field, as opposed to rolling up into a single brand and then having to try and explain to your consumer, oh, well, I'm an expert in this, but I'm also an expert in this, and I'm an expert in this, and I'm an expert in this. I think patients generally feel like, if you're an expert in everything, are you really an expert in anything, right? So their approach is to keep the brand separate so that that individual brand can be known for one thing and have a reputation for one thing. I think the other thing too to bear in mind is, again, going back to budget and how much you want to build brand equity and how much you're willing to pay to build brand equity, in terms of man hours, content creation, and in terms of just media dollars, right? Is how much equity exists in the current brand that you're acquiring, right? And is the parent brand eventually going to outweigh that in terms of the equity that's in that brand? And if the play is that the parent brand is ultimately going to outweigh the individual brands within your portfolio, then maybe you should start to push to that single brand, right? So obviously a client that we have that fits that mold, Warren, that you and I know very well, is LifeStance, whereby when they initially started out, they were a single brand. I mean, there were multiple brands. They were a house of brands, essentially. And then eventually the parent brand became the sort of Goliath, the behemoth. And even though they still have properties that are, their own individual brands, it's a tiny percentage of their traffic, of their patient acquisition, of their engagement. And really the majority of their efforts is around branding life stands. So again, I think trying to determine where you want the equity to lie and in which brand also should shape what the strategy is that you go for and which approach you take.
Yeah. Yep. The marketing kind of point of view on it, I think, is spot on there, Rich. I think the one thing that I always ask in return, and if you're listening today and you haven't asked this yet, is contractually, what are you obligated to from a brand management perspective? And sometimes that is the answer initially. And there's not always, like in the LifeStance case, a situation in which we're only this or only that. Sometimes it's a multi-year kind of migration from multiple, house of brand into a single brand. And sometimes I've seen cases where you've started as a house of, or a single brand, and the opportunities to acquire groups have shown that it actually is more effective in making those acquisitions and a strong selling point to allow them to keep their brand. And then perhaps you've kind of gone the other way. So I think that's the number one question first I always ask is, what do the contracts say? Let's start there and do what we need to do. And then let's make the most of the situation that we have to work within. Jacqueline, I would be curious your point of view, because your team is most typically handling the website properties. And we know that a house of brands scenario can get unmanageable. So I'm sure your considerations may be a little bit different than Rich's.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rich was spot on. It really is a decision you have to make based on, what type of brand you want to be and what type of brands you want your acquisitions and your new practices to be as well. So I do think it's important to have that vision going in and try to build around that rather than trying to retrofit your digital presence to make it work. What I think about from the SEO perspective is user experience. So I think that means so much more than just your actual website experience. It really is from the moment a potential patient or client learns about your brand, what is the experience that they're having, and is it consistent, and is it a cohesive, accessible experience for them? So the way that you design your website really needs to mirror what your brand is, so that you can really deliver that clear user experience and help patients understand what you're all about, what you're an expert at, what you provide in terms of services, because that's what search engines are going to be looking at too. All of those signals really go hand in hand. And in terms of equity, what we sort of perceive that as in the SEO world is authority. And I think cohesion and consistency across your entities or singular entity, if you want to maintain that single brand, I think that consistency is really crucial. So being able to make a clear decision and having that vision of who your patients are going to interact with in mind, I think that will lay the foundation for what you decide to do digitally.
And I think there's another consideration here, which, this is a discussion centered around digital, but I hear a lot of challenges is what do you envision the team looking like long-term? And do you have a roadmap that, from a team perspective or resource perspective that then matches the path that you intend to take? And, the multiple properties, house of brands approach sometimes does require a larger, set of players. There's going to be more hands needed to manage more properties. And is that kind of a plan that you're willing to work with and for? So I would say team structure and resourcing is probably usually another consideration. Can we be effective with, XYZ budget and XYZ resources? From a marketing perspective, you probably have counterparts on, the operation side that feel the same pain points. How are you all working together to either retain a house of brands or work with some sort of hybrid model? I think that encompasses some of the major considerations that we usually go through. I'm gonna move back towards some of our discussion points, because we're gonna get deeper into those pain points and some of the solutions. Before I do that, I wanted to address a comment that came through in the chat. And Rich, I think this is a good one for you, because this is something we've been talking a lot about. And it was around, as you are in, the MSO kind of growth mindset, and you're thinking about digital demand gen, strategy, budget, new geographies, where to go, are there considerations that you would think of in what the go-to-market strategy should look like if you're entering a new geography versus one that you're already in? Is that something that you kind of think about in structuring the overall approach?
So just so I understand the question, when are you saying, is the question, do you have a different way of evaluating expansion depending on whether you're a multi-brand or a single brand?
I think it could go either way. I think there's expansion from a business perspective, yes. And how then what does your strategy look like, your go-to-market demand gen strategy? And I think giving your opinion on if you see differences and nuances from being a house of brand versus a unified brand would be, and I would be interested to hear your answer on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously if you are a high growth brand, from a purely marketing point of view, it's easier to expand if it's a single brand, right? So because you're usually the messaging can be exactly the same, maybe just localized by the location that you're going into. If you're running anything up a funnel, anything disruptive, the assets can be uniform. If you're doing remarketing, the assets can be uniform. The landing page, the website, the tracking, all these things that you would need in order to deploy campaigns in new locations. It's much easier to get these up and running if you're a single brand versus if you're a multi-brand through acquisitions in different markets, right? In terms of market evaluation, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely something that you want to think about. I think whether you're a single brand that is expanding out from a de novo point of view or from an acquisition point of view, or if you're a multi-brand that is expanding out from an acquisition point of view, you're definitely going to want to evaluate as part of your due diligence. You're definitely going to want to evaluate the digital landscape if part of your growth strategy for these new markets is contingent on digital patient acquisition, right? So I think you can certainly go into new markets where the referral sources are so good from, doctors and hospitals, et cetera, where some businesses don't really need a digital layer. But if you are reliant on a direct consumer digital layer, then yeah, you're definitely going to want to understand what the demand is in those markets that you're entering. And I think that's easy-ish to do through various tools that we've been working on, and tools that exist out there, right? So obviously keyword planner and things like that on the most basic level through Google, performance planner. I know Jacqueline uses a ton of competitive and forecasting tools on her side, things like SEMrush, Moz, tools that you guys are aware of to understand what the search demand is. And then obviously through DSPs and DMPs, you can take a look at, is this area rich in my target audience? Are the demographics of these people align with my business? So you can kind of get a sense of, how favorable that new market is in terms of digital patient acquisition, to give you a sense, utilizing benchmarks, although you have to be wary of those, of what you could potentially drive through digital channels if you were to go into that new market. I mean, other stuff too, like looking at competition, what is the density of other like businesses in that area? What is their reputation of those businesses, right? Like, do they have a very high reputation? Do they have a lot of brand equity? Are people talking about those businesses favorably in the local community? All these sort of points should help you determine, is this a great place to go and put down roots and try and grow my business in this location?
I think too, one of the data points we've been using, and then I'll get us back on track, is the provider density in a given area. How many, what is our opportunity to hire and retain talent to be able to serve this market too? And are we better suited to acquire an existing brand in this market where those things are more solidified? Or do we feel confident that we can come in as a brand that's an outsider, a brand that we've been managing in other markets, and put down those roots effectively on both sides, the provider and the patient side. So, Rich, I'm going to have to get a graphic on your scale of easy-ish to hard, and then we'll just put it in this deck and send it out to everyone, because that's a big scale.
Yeah, easy-ish.
Easy-ish. Yeah. Yeah.
Ish is the key bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, great. Let's pop this back open. I want to dive in. And Rich, I know we're going to talk. So if you guys didn't get a chance to attend our event on goal setting, we did like a deep dive with Rich and our director of media strategy, Evan, on goal setting. That recording is online. You can go find it. We're going to touch on a couple of those high points just as part of this discussion, because goal setting it's effective and necessary in some of kind of the micro activities that we do, but it's also something that could lend some additional considerations and thought starters for you as you make the decision around, am I going to keep these brands, individual regional brands, or am I going to roll them up? So, Rich, I'll let you kind of talk us through your thoughts on goal setting and how our team listening in should be considering it.
Yeah, I think we could keep this really short, like five minutes, if that. But I think the point is here in terms of defining your brand strategy or your single brand versus multi-brand approach as an MSO is you're not just plucking that decision out of thin air, right? Like the chances are you probably don't. That's not the ultimate goal. Is should I be a single brand or multi-brand? It probably is. What you're really thinking about is which of these approaches best helps me to meet my ultimate goal, right? Which is, it might be a certain number of patients per year growth or top line revenue growth or profitability or whatever that goal is, right? It's like, which of these approaches is best going to help me get there? And in order to determine that, you need to have solid goals at the acquisition level that then ladder into those larger goals, which might be a revenue goal or a profitability goal, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's key before you make the decision around whether or not you want to go the single brand or the multi-brand route is to define these goals really well, to define these acquisition goals that are going to let you achieve those revenue goals, and then look at the problem and say, okay, which of these solutions is going to get do I believe is going to get me to that end goal most effectively, right? And so obviously, in order for you to do that, you have to have well thought out goals that are measurable, that are attainable, that actually meet the needs of the business, that your entire team have alignment on and believe in, and that are shared throughout the organization. So you guys are all aiming towards the same thing. And like Lauren said, we did this webinar about goal setting, but it's also really important to share these goals that you guys devise with your agency, right? Because obviously a lot of you probably work with outside partners, obviously our clients do. And if there's not alignment on goals, you're going to have people working in silos, doing the wrong thing, not being efficient, everyone's not paddling the boat in the same direction. And so that's just really key. It's just a really key bit of the foundational work before you start to consider this question of single brand versus multi-brand. And we covered off on a lot of issues, but the biggest ones that we see are that we get when people give us goals, because we always ask for their goals, like, hey, what are you trying to do with your digital strategy? What are you trying to do with your digital investment? Is we'll often get ambiguous goals, right? Like they're not easy for us to translate into what we should be doing in terms of work. Like we said here, they're not defined by maybe the location, the service line, the market. Potentially they're not measurable, right? So it'll be something somewhat ambiguous, like I just need to increase patient revenue, I just need to increase new patient volume, but they don't necessarily have the tools to pass that back to us to show that new patient volume is going up. So again, we'll talk about this later, but having the right data points and analytics to help you understand if these goals are correct and you're actually meeting them. And then maybe they're just not thinking about the market or the business. I think we're just talking about market expansion just now. Maybe they're not thinking of these goals don't take into consideration the actual landscape that's out there, how competitive it is, how many other players already exist in space that might be better established. So there's just a lot of things that need to be done in terms of goal planning and goal validation. And that's a piece that I would recommend that you do first, and that you get really clear on these things, especially around the measurability. And then, talking about sort of need, that's the next biggest thing, right? That ladders into this is you really need to understand what you're setting out to do with goals, and probably at different stages of the organization with different sections of the business, right? So for us on our some of the questions that we ask around goals when we get down to the work that we do for our clients is, what are you trying to achieve? Is it, I'm trying to get the absolute lowest patient acquisition cost across the entire system of my brands or all my locations that roll into my single brand? Do I not really care too much about efficiency, but I'm going for volume? Am I trying to fill capacity at individual locations? Is it to build brand awareness in a certain market, or because I've got de novo location openings? Like, all these things are going to influence what your ultimate strategy is, because all of these goals have different ways of achieving them. So I think just being really clear on what those strategic priorities are and making sure that you have very strong alignment across the organization is a key foundational piece before you get into making this decision about how you want to go forward with your brand or your house of brands.
Rich, I was going to add one more thing to the common mistakes, and it's not a mistake. It's sometimes, I think, a consideration that gets overlooked initially, which is, and I like to ask this, in the house of brands scenario, and having done work in a former life in franchise, are the groups that you're acquiring and potentially retaining, are they contributing a portion of their revenues into marketing? And are those then, is there a requirement that that exact dollar amount must be spent for their locations? Is there a contribution boiling up into an overall marketing fund that can then be used to achieve the business's goals, and answer the questions you just showed us here on this slide? Is there, is all marketing being managed by the MSO, and that's kind of how it's being funded, and the fluidity across that is then able to be used for things like, focusing on filling capacity at certain locations, right? So that answering that question, I think, also helps us understand how fluid across a system of brands can we be in accomplishing the goal, even though there are individual entities that kind of each have their own sub goals in them. So I would add that to the list of maybe not mistakes, but questions to ask yourself.
Yeah, the next slide we kind of talked about already, right? Like, how do you determine when I go into a new market? How do I set forecasts and targets, etc.? So again, I think we kind of covered off.
Yeah, I think this was a bit of an answer to Matt's question that he had put in the chat. What are the considerations when you're planning for demand gen? And these are definitely some of them. So we've talked a little bit about goal setting. It's going to help us lay the foundation. The foundation of likely your first challenge and what you're looking to tackle is the website situation, and answering the question of how to best handle this, your ecosystem of websites, little website with parenthesis S on the end, if that's your scenario, is probably the first thing that your first challenge that you're looking to answer. And I know a lot of groups, especially with acquisitions, are looking to show value in the first 100 days. And so this is a really positive way to build a structure that then allows you to bring that value even earlier than 100 days to get, a new visual kind of digital storefront in front of the patients that can really start affecting change pretty quick. I'll say quickly-ish, according to Rich's terminology. So Jacqueline, I want to get your thoughts on why the architecture matters, some of the consideration around architecture. Anyone who's listening that is in this right now or in the planning stages will probably appreciate some of the thought points that you can give them.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that, this might be the first challenge that MSOs are up against, but really this is just an extension of the larger question of who you are as a brand and how you're positioning yourself, and your acquisitions and new openings, how you're positioning yourself as a group, or as separate entities. So it's very important to have that vision before you go into a website planning, because your website architecture really should mirror that and reflect who you are at a brand level. So I'm going to start a little bit in reverse and talk about why site architecture matters before I actually explain what it is. Yeah, exactly. So really think about your website. Think about the first page that someone lands on, or think about any website if you don't have one yet. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to take in the information on the homepage, and then you're going to move to the next page and so on and so forth until you're ready to make a decision, which might be to take an action on the website or to leave, or some variation of either. But really, search engines work the same way. They are going to start at the front of your website and work their way through every link. So when you think about architecture for a website, it really is similar to architecture for a house. You have to make sure that the entryway is going to, bring people into the rooms that you want them to see, and help them understand what each room includes, so that they can really understand at a larger level who you are, what you're offering, and why they should be on your website in the first place.
So maybe don't like have your front door open up into like a closet or a bathroom kind of situation.
Exactly. And looking more specifically at what that actually means, there are a ton of components that go into exactly what an architecture is. But ultimately, it's the puzzle that you're creating of your website and all of the pieces that you're then putting together to make it. So like I said, Google is going to navigate your website and the internet through links. So the foundation of a site architecture is really how your website connects at different levels, what the relationships are between pages. And these elements that I've listed out here are just ways that you do that. So site navigation, like I said, is kind of your entryway. Crawl depth is a term that is very important in SEO, as well as user experience. Basically, how many clicks does it take to get to the information that you're after? So just like a house, you don't want to put the most important service that you offer in a back room that takes, several stairs and a few different alleyways to get to. You want to make it very clear. And all of these, like I said, all of these different elements, internal links, your site maps, how you categorize content, all of this is going to create that larger picture. So this is kind of a unique challenge for MSOs, and I think this is something that a lot of us probably can relate to, is the first big challenge: what kind of website or websites do I want? And like I said, this really should mirror your larger brand architecture and who you view yourself as a brand. But there are a few different options that you kind of have as you're building out your larger organization. So we're going to talk through just some of the granular elements of each of these, and give some examples of what you might consider as you're making this decision. So first of all, when I talk about site structure, I'm really talking about like what is happening on your website and how are users navigating from one brand to another, from one page to another, location to another. And the three main buckets that we tend to look at in terms of actual design and build is: do I have a subdomain? Do I have a subdirectory, which is a folder on the same root domain? Do I have totally separate websites for all of my brands? So this is going to depend a lot on who you are. So that again is the first decision to make. But I'll give some examples of kind of what works when. The first one I'll look at here is a subdomain. This is kind of a direction I think a lot of brands go first. And really what this is it's a separate entity on top of one core domain. So in this case, I think this is a really good example of a use case. If you have separate audiences, such as careers, providers, recruitment versus patients, B2C, actually connecting with someone who's going to receive the service, those are totally different audiences. And it's a great use case to have separate entities that are still connected through the main domain. So these are, technically speaking, crawled separately, your analytics are separate, your theme is separate. Really, you want to do this if your audience for each entity is going to have its own needs, its own unique value proposition that it needs to understand, and totally unique content.
And that is usually when the actual visual brand name and identity is the same, but the need for the content needs to shift, right? So in this case, I know you've got Vital Skin here as an example. They've got kind of multiple brands, but all tied to the Vital Skin kind of parent brand. And some MSOs, the MSO is truly just the kind of B2B acquisition and hiring entity, and the patient-facing brand is something different or multiple, different entities, in which case this would not make sense.
Exactly. And this often makes sense too if you have totally different services, even though you are trying to maintain that same look and feel and same branding. So if you offer orthodontics at some locations, but only dentistry at another, or only dental surgery at another, that might be a situation where you really need to evaluate if your audience is looking for the same thing, or if you need to create totally separate entities. Another option though, if you want to go the opposite direction and keep everything in one cohesive place is to have everything live off of the root domain and be organized into folders. So an example here is a client where they have a number of locations, but at each location they're offering the same or very similar services. So the way that you can organize it through folders is simply having locations as your main folder, maybe having states, or just having the location page live directly off that locations folder. In this situation though, all of those location pages, they all get to benefit from the same authority and equity of that main domain. There's no splitting it up. So this is often the easiest way to gain brand equity. And if that is your main focus, this is a great option for you. Downside is if you have a lot of content and you are a more complex brand, it can be a bit bloated over time to manage something like this. So you really have to go into this type of structure with a very clean focus on what your services are, what your locations are, how they work together. And in this structure, we'll talk about this in a minute, but this is where modular design and clean layouts really come into play and really need to be a focal point.
Jacqueline, I like to give the advice that if your vision is that you have maybe a 12-month vision in which I'm making an acquisition, we have a timeline to kind of go from brand A to brand A by MSO and then move them into the MSO once kind of the patients get comfortable with it, the operations teams transition. This is a good structure. You kind of want a scenario in which your kind of master unified brand site and the local regional site coexist for a period of time, and that equity kind of transfers, and then you redirect and the patients kind of don't feel the pain of that. So this is probably most common scenario that we come across in cases where you have a vision to unify at some point.
On the total opposite end of the spectrum are your separate domains. So a lot of businesses also go this route. Like Lauren said at the beginning, there's no wrong answer. And we see this answer a lot when you are acquiring existing businesses who already have a lot of equity in their space and you want to maintain that and kind of honor the existing practice as it existed prior to the acquisition. So we do see this a lot. The benefit of maintaining separate websites is they can exist as they were. So if you're inheriting a great website, you can work with that. You get all of the equity that it already has, and there's no kind of messiness with redirecting. But everything is going to be totally separate. So your SEO strategy, similar to if you're doing a subdomain, it really has to be duplicated across every location. But in this situation where you have truly unique domains with nothing in common, the performance is going to be pretty inconsistent. So if tracking at a holistic level or at a regional level, when you have multiple unique domains with unique brands at play is a focus, that's going to be really complex with a structure like this. This also gets really complex to manage, of course. I'm sure you can imagine managing 40 different websites with 40 different sets of service pages, 40 different brands, 40 different themes. That becomes a lot fast. And so you have to be willing to either prioritize which markets and websites you want to focus in on, or you need to have a realistic budget for what you can devote to all of those brands at once.
And one of the kind of make the most of the situation that you have, answers here is, and we see a lot of groups doing this, build a single kind of website theme or template, whatever you want to call it, and move the brands onto those so that structurally your backends are identical. Kind of how to manage those. You can push, major changes like online scheduling, integrating that is easier because you know that you're integrating it into the same structure, but you get to keep, things like the logo. You can have different primary and secondary colors, fonts that allow the brands to still feel different. So that's something we often see. In this case too, if you're able to, where the services are streamlined or consistent, is to kind of write your content and structure some of your initial SEO efforts around best practice and what the patient really needs. And then, you can worry about things like duplicate content and, variances for location nuance or service nuance as you roll that content out across your suite or family of sites. So there's some efficiency to be gained here if you're willing to kind of, do a templated approach. And it's a way that a lot of groups will add value initially too. This is what I meant by you can add value in the first 100 days, if not sooner, by having kind of your template and web strategy built out and on deck. And when you acquire Silver Screen Dental, you move them onto a brand new site with an improved user experience and new content in 60 days. And they feel and see the lift from that. Jacqueline, I know you've got kind of some other factors to consider, and I think we've touched on these. So I'm going to keep us moving into the SEO foundation, and then we'll get with Rich on paid media.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the good news, like Lauren said originally, there's no wrong way to build your site, but there are best practices to keep in mind that can make it a lot easier. When you go into building your website or approaching maybe a suite of websites, it's really important to think about not just what the state is right now, but what you really want the state to be in terms of management and operations and branding, months, years down the line. So building a very scalable website is the first foundation for that. It's really important that if you have the ability to start from scratch, that you are using a very clean but customizable template for your websites. Like Lauren said, if you're managing multiple websites, having them all on similar themes can be very, very helpful in management, because it really unifies at least the operations of your team. The way that we typically approach our websites for multi-local clients is a modular design. So what I mean by that is, we have a page template, we have page types, but we have some flexibility with the modules we include on each page. So we can kind of build our own drag and drop system to make sure each page has all the fundamentals that it needs in terms of content. And we can really kind of skip all of the stuff we don't need. That ends up being a problem, especially as you build out lots and lots of pages or lots of subdomains. You really don't want your site to get bloated from unnecessary code weight. So having a clean and of course responsive design is going to make long-term maintenance so much easier.
And Jacqueline, I'll give the group a quick example. So if you're opening, and acquiring locations, and some of them will have virtual appointment availability and some won't, rather than having all these different types and templates for your locations based on what they offer, a simple virtual care module that can be dragged into a page if it does have it, or hidden if it doesn't, allows you to be dynamic and kind of keep your site lightweight and build these pages or locations out in 5 minutes and not have to go kind of back to the design and development drawing board with each unique circumstance.
For sure. And dynamic modules can make that a lot easier too. We do that a lot with services and locations. If you are adding a location every day, make sure your homepage has a module that dynamically pulls in all of those new locations as post types. That cuts down on the time you have to go in and add links and make sure you're on top of every interlinking strategy. So little things like that can make the process a lot easier. But ultimately what we're getting at and what your SEO team is going to really focus on is what's on your website. So I want you guys to think, as when it comes to content, as it's not really just the words on each page. Google has really prioritized being helpful in providing a satisfying, rewarding experience to users. So when you think about what needs to go on your site, especially in the age of AI, it's very easy to think we can just churn out 2,000 words on any given topic and we're good to go. But I approach, and our SEO team approaches content in a much more holistic way, where you're really thinking about the value each page is adding to each user. And again, having that clean modular design is going to make this so much easier, because you have a good sandbox to work in and you don't have to start from scratch on each page.
I'm going to look here, because I think this is exactly what we were talking about, creating, writing for the patient and not for the search engines.
Exactly. Really what you need to focus on with your website is very simple. It's how do you provide value to your patients? How do you answer the questions they're asking, showcase what you're offering to them, help Google and your patients understand who you are, what you offer, and why they should choose you for that service. And
for everyone listening, do not forget about your citations, please. Sorry, my dog is barking. That's the reality of the world we live in today. If you are growing through acquisitions, specifically, Jacqueline, we've seen this time and time again, and you plan to do brand name changes and you have to make major adjustments, get a citation management solution. There are so many out there. There are ones that are also reputation management tools, ones that integrate into your website and allow you to populate your listings that way. So if you are ever, wondering what the best technologies are in this space, hit me up on LinkedIn, hit Jacqueline up. We can give you some tips. But I think sometimes if there is one thing you can do fastest to get onto the SERPs, even before you're kind of working on that website structure that we know can take some time, this is it.
Yeah, this is huge. And a lot of times what I'll say to clients who are, not sure if they should do paid ads, not sure how long it's going to take for their website to show up in organic search, this can be something that holds you over, is all of your presence in listings, directories, other websites. And Google is really looking at every brand as an entity. It's not just your site. It's not just your listings. It's not just your Google profile. It really is all of those things together. So making sure you have an extremely consistent view for your users and making sure they can understand at any entry point who you are, should they trust you, are you legitimate, and do you offer what they're looking for? That's going to be obviously key on your website, but it's extremely key in your listings as well. So making sure that you're thinking about your Google business profile, you're thinking about all your listings and your reputation management, that will all work together to improve your overall organic visibility and your visibility in general.
Jacqueline, we got an awesome question in the chat about kind of a subdirectory scenario. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to Rich's talking about the marketing tech stack. But Katie, I see your comment and I'm hoping we have time to get to it. If we don't, I will connect you with Jacqueline and we'll make sure to get, some thoughts and opinions on your current scenario. I'm sure everyone else would like to hear it too, though. So we'll work on getting some Q&A here at the very end. So Rich, probably the second most frequently asked question we get is, and I just alluded to it with the citation management technology, but what technology do I need to make this thing work? So I want to get some thoughts from you on that. I know you've got some examples here.
Yeah, and I think this is really where the single brand approach kind of has an advantage, right? Which is to Jacqueline's point earlier, talking about a client where you have multi-brand and you have different websites and maybe you have 40 different Google Analytics properties, right? As you guys can see, this is just some examples of MarTech that you guys will be utilizing probably. That is not even the full example, right? Like I don't have like an email solution in here, or there's all kinds of other MarTech CRMs not included. So this is just a snapshot of some of the solutions you would need. And obviously, if you're multi-site, multi-brand, these technical solutions become far more difficult, right? So like you may have different tracking needs across multiple websites. You may have different Google Analytics properties, you may have different Google Ads accounts, and essentially it becomes very, very difficult to manage. Like if you have 230 different Google Ads accounts, right, you're spending your entire time managing in that place rather than building a MarTech solution that's going to meet the needs of the patient and help you to reach your goals more efficiently. So I think in terms of MarTech complexity, a single brand approach with a single website approach definitely has significant advantages. Obviously, we know that that's not the only consideration that you guys have, as we've talked about a bunch of others already in this discussion. I would say, though, that if you have a multi-brand approach, or even if you have a single brand approach, when you are deploying technology, you should be focusing in on what's going to be the biggest return on investment first, right? And so especially if you have a complex setup, if you go to the next slide, Lauren, one of the things you're definitely going to want to have is, and if data points are really important to you, which they are for most businesses these days, and you have to report out to higher ups and C-suites and all that fun stuff, right? And stakeholders in the board, you're going to want to have a really strong ETL solution, right? A reporting solution that can ingest the data from all the different platforms that you utilize, whether it be advertising platforms, analytics platforms, whether it's live chat, call tracking, whatever it might be that you're using to drive your marketing efforts. and then synthesize it, right? Transform it and synthesize it, and then put it out in easy to digest and disseminate reporting visualizations that live ideally in a single place, right? And so one of the things that we do for our clients is, we utilize a tool called Funnel that allows us to pull in every single data source that we use, and then create useful roll-ups. So maybe it's maybe you have 5 different brands. We can show you guys data by each of those individual brands across multiple different marketing platforms and technologies that you're utilizing. Maybe you have 250 locations. We can roll up everything into that location. Maybe you have multiple service lines, all these different things that you're trying to measure. This tool essentially allows us to report out on that and help you guys show the progress that you're making, and validate your efforts to everybody else inside the organization.
Even in its simplest form, Rich, I mean, 200 websites equals 200 analytics profiles, and getting just a single snapshot of your traffic across those profiles, sure. Right? You've got to have a solution, a warehouse of that data that can be combined and rolled up. Absolutely.
Beyond that, I think the tech solutions that we deem to be most valuable, at least on our side, if the ultimate goal is patient acquisition, right, is great tracking. So, one of the things that we're doing as an agency is we're pushing towards better understanding the quality of leads that we're driving for our clients, more so than just the quantity of leads. This is a snapshot from a technology called Line that essentially tells us the outcomes of the interactions that we drive through our efforts, right? So if we're driving a number of, in the old world, we would be driving calls and forms. In the new world, we understand the disposition of all of those forms and all of those calls, whether they became a new patient, whether they're an existing patient. And we also understand the reasons why they didn't become a new patient if they were a new patient lead. So maybe we're driving a ton of activity that is Medicaid or out-of-network insurance, or you don't offer that treatment, or there's a scheduling issue, you can't fit people in. So again, when we think about prioritizing the MarTech stack, having the ability to measure what you're driving from a digital patient acquisition piece is right up there in terms of what we would say to focus on first. I think beyond that, the next thing, and obviously this is a shift that we're moving towards, but having a trackable online scheduling technology. So some of these stats and some of the stats around online scheduling is pretty intense. So 67% of patients now prefer online booking, 34% of appointments that are scheduled online are done so after the office is closed. So just having a good phone number, a prominent phone number, is not really going to cut it anymore, right? Because a lot of people are making those appointments or want to make those appointments at 8 p.m. because they have a really busy life. If you're anything like me and Lauren, you have tiny little kids running around. And so, you can't get to it during the workday. So I think but it's important not just to have an online scheduler. That's great for patient acquisition and for the user experience, which Jacqueline was talking about, but make it trackable, right? Make sure that you're using a solution that allows you to feed data into your PMS and your EHR system. Obviously, you've got to integrate. That's really important, but also that fires back to your ad platforms or your Google Analytics, because you want to understand what's driving those appointments in the first place so that you can do more of it, right? So again, I think this is kind of critical technology that you guys should be embracing early doors, no matter whether you're multi-brand or single brand, but when you get set up. Finally, just a obligatory shout out to GA4. Embrace it. You're going to be forced to do it anyway. So I would say, if you haven't made the switch to GA4 yet, make sure you do so, because there's some great features in there that will help you better understand acquisition and the health of the website, and make sure that you're, again, making better decisions.
So Rich, we left a whopping 6 minutes for our favorite paid media discussion, but we'll get through what we can. We've got a ton of resources on our website about this, and happy to talk one-on-one with anyone who's listening as well. But I think a lot of people want to know, it goes back to Matt's question, how am I going to build a demand gen strategy that, meets my business's needs and works with the structure that I have?
Yeah. So, I think we've covered off on this already in the goals section, right? But all the strategy has to start with the goals. Like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to support patient volume at a certain location? Are you trying to just increase the patient volume across the entire system? That's the number one step. The second step, which Jacqueline has already alluded to, is have a great user experience, right? Again, you'll be amazed at how many clients we've seen over the years want to spend tons of money on paid media, but then they have an absolutely terrible user experience. This is a great screenshot here of this website that's all about this doctor and his hobbies before you can even get into like booking an appointment. So just try and avoid that. And I think, we're all getting a little bit more sophisticated about user experience and patient needs, but just make sure you have a good landing page, or at least a good website that you can drive them to, that really explains your value props, differentiates you. Why should someone utilize you? Answers their common questions. That's kind of table stakes.
And Rich, bringing it back to another kind of tick on the box of things like landing pages. When you do have multiple brands, it becomes a scale and complexity that you just have to have the resources to manage. And the answer isn't that it's wrong or bad. It's just it's a bigger lift. So you just have to kind of know what you're up against when you start scaling out, with dozens and dozens of brands.
100%. So in terms of like, then what should you do, right? Again, you've let's say you've got your goals, but also the other two things that are going to impact which channels you should deploy is going to be the landscape and then user behavior, right? So search is usually the most efficient patient acquisition tool out there, right? But it's great for businesses where patients already know what the solution is. So if you think about like dentists and stuff, they already know, most people are searching a dentist or dentist near me, right? They understand that if their tooth hurts, they want to go to a dentist. If you have other much more niche pieces, much more niche like healthcare businesses that are typically from a provider referral, maybe just relying on search alone is not the way to go, right? Because people don't really know what to search, right? They're not going to be typing in the name of that business. They might be typing in something way further up the funnel that's more around a condition or a problem or a treatment. It's much more of an exploratory search. And so search alone may not make sense because those searches are not particularly transactional. And that's where you may need to start thinking about more awareness and upper funnel. The other place where you really need to start thinking about that as well is if maybe there's search volume, but there's not a lot of relevant search volume. And so you want to drive more patient acquisition than there is relevant search volume that you can cover. So search is a great starting point and a great foundation, but it might not meet your entire needs from a patient acquisition point of view. And you should be prepared to go beyond that. Moving beyond search, you've got stuff like contextual display, so keyword-based display. Again, this is great for people who are more problem aware, who they might not necessarily know the solution, but they're searching for conditions. And then you can introduce your solution to them via a native ad, a display ad. You can even use Connect TV. And then once an audience has been exposed to those ads, you can then remarket to them on your social networks and stuff. And then from a pure prospecting point of view, social and Connect TV is great for engaging with core audiences. So you may have people who are not actively seeking out your services right now, but you have a demographic that you just want to have constant awareness, a low-level awareness with all the time and establish credibility with, so that when they are seeking, and that they will be at some point, they remember, they have brand recall, they remember you guys, and you kind of top of their list when they're considering which option to go for. I think we can kind of skip over this slide. It's just more on the same. Start with search, start with demand capture, but then I would always say test in a demand generation component. So if you're spending, you might be spending 70% of your budget on demand capture, which is remarketing, contextual search. But then, leave 30% for demand generation. So that might be performance max in the case of this slide, which can be highly efficient, or paid social. If you've got a great offer, so for dentists, paid social is great, right? Like if you got like 20% off, and it's very sort of promo based, paid social will work well. And also if you want to differentiate yourself by having a strong brand story, or you need strong brand recognition because you're in a highly competitive market, social can work really well. Also works well for behavioral health. So it's just trying to understand what your goal and your need is and what the landscape is, and where your users are. That's going to drive you really to understand what your media mix should be. And that's our job, obviously, as your agency, to help guide you in that regard. I think the final thing,
you mentioned, working well. That is all relative to the goals that we've set, and working well, social working well for Aspen Dental is because it can drive actual appointment bookings at probably a comparable rate to search with promotional messaging. Social can work well for groups whose objective out of social is to, enter a new market and serve their brand message and kind of, be known amongst the population too. Working well doesn't always have to be the same for every channel, every initiative, every campaign.
Yeah, I know we haven't touched on slide 40, but I mean, I don't know if we can go over
there. Yeah, we'll end there. Here we are.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's totally right? So connected TV is an example. It's never going to drive patient acquisition at a CPA that search will. But what it's going to do is it's going to give you brand credibility, right? Because still being on that big screen at home for most consumers, that's sort of the high watermark of brand credibility, right? Like they're on TV, they must be a credible brand. The internet is still, for certain consumer groups, still considered more of like a Wild West, like everybody can be on the internet advertising. So, it's not as credible, but if you're on television, there's a certain cachet that comes with that. So connected TV is great if you want to establish yourself as a credible player in the market and spend time with your consumer. You can spend, you can increase the time spent with the brand by over 250% because these units are non-skippable. So if you've got a target market that you really want to spend time with, this is a great place to start building your brand awareness with them. And then you can remarket to the exposed users on other channels like display and native and social, and nurture them down the funnel until they're ready to convert and do the things that you want them to do, which is become a patient. So that was very quick. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I there's always so much to be discussed. We appreciate everyone for hanging on with us. I know we're a minute over. I hope we got to most of your questions, whether you submitted them in the chat or you had submitted them in your registration form. Katie, and those of you who we did not get to your kind of specific use case, look for an email. I will reach out to you and we'll connect and make sure that we get you the answers that you need. We so appreciate everyone joining. Rich and Jacqueline, thank you all for being here, sharing your wisdom. We could probably talk about this for 5 hours and, not have all the answers, but some tips and tricks that hopefully y'all can take away and get into your marketing programs. So everyone have a great afternoon and we'll see you guys next month. See ya.